I know what he got up to on the seventh line of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. So we're on page 41 in Masechet Zevachim, and we're in the middle of a discussion, which is based on some very confusing psukim, right? And I assume everyone has reviewed some of this over the last couple of days, but I'm going to try to do a quick summary just in case it's not so fresh. And it's because the Torah talks about several different karbanot that are, I would say, grouped together, but it doesn't give us all the information about all the karbanot, right? So in the beginning of Parshat, not the beginning, but in Parshat Vayikra, it talks about the karbanot of the par of the Kohen Mashiach, right? So if a Kohen a Mashiach, so the Kohen Gadol does a sin, he brings a par. And in that parsha, I don't actually have a chumash in front of me, but in that parsha, it actually gives very detailed instructions about what to do with that karban. You have to sprinkle it 7 times on the parochet and 4 times on the mizbeach, all the details. And it also talks about burning the fats, right? Yoteret hakaved and the klayot, all burnt on the mizbeach. Then it goes, that's one section. Then the next section in the Torah is what we call the par helim davar shel tzibor. Same animal, par, done for a community, a tzibor that forgets a mitzvah, and we learned all about this in Hariot, and does the avera. And there it has very similar details, but it leaves out some of them. So it talks about sprinkling it and shechting it, of course, and burning and putting the what's called the shirayim, the utera, but it doesn't talk about burning the fats, right? And then we learned, and we talked about this yesterday and the day before, that we learned that it says at the end of it, says, do for this par, aseh for the par chatat, kasher aseh for the other par, right? So we were learning yesterday, this was something called Tanad Rabbi Shmuel, that we are comparing these two karbanot to tell you, well, that was one interpretation, that you do all the same things for both of them. The third karban, which is not in Vayikra, it's actually much later in Parshat Shlach, in Bamidbar, is what's called the Sa'ir Avodah Zarah. Remember, if a person does Avodah Zarah b'shogeg, by mistake, they bring a special karban called a Sa'ir, if a community does this, right? And it's a Sa'ir. And the Sa'ir also has very minimal details, and we learned yesterday that we learned those out from the par of the Tzibor. And of course, the fourth group, just to make it more complicated, was the Par of Yom Kippur, right? Which is really a whole different kind of thing because it's brought, as we termed yesterday, for things you don't know about and etc. But it's also a par, and we learn many things from one to the other. So yesterday we ended up the daf with Rav Papa's opinion that Rav Tanad Rabbi Shmuel holds that even though you learn something with a hekesh by comparing A to B, you can then learn through a kal v'chomer. You can then chozer malamed b'kal v'chomer. And now that's we're up to the second word on the seventh line of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara, lepar, right? It says asa lepar, kasher asa to the other par. Now says the Braita, this is a quote from the Braita yesterday, Zeh par helam davar shel tzibor. Do to this par what you do to the other par. What does it mean, do to this par? Do to, why, it's an extra word. It could have said do to this animal, right? What we're talking about. Why did it say the word par? To tell you par helam davar shel tzibor, telling you that this par, Helem Davar Shel Tzibor, has to have all these special things. Says the Gemara, but that's what we're talking about. This pasuk is written in the story in the parsha of Par Helem Davar Shel Tzibor. So ask the Gemara, Habit Tzibor Gufei Ktiv. The pasuk is written by Par Helem Davar Shel Tzibor. So why is there an extra word, the asa lepar, kasher asa lepar, of this par of Helem Davar Shel Tzibor? Just say v'asa kasher asa lepar. So says Rav Papa today, Mishum de boya gmuri par helam davar shel tzibor bioteret ushtei klayot l'sirei avodah kochavim. I'm going to read that inside. Says Rav Papa, because we want to learn from the par helam davar shel tzibor that just like by the par helam davar shel tzibor, you have to burn the fats on the mizbeach, the yoteret hakaved, which is the extra fat on the liver, and the klayot, right? L'sirei avodah kochavim, that you have to do that also by avodah kochavim. Okay, now that's great. We talked yesterday about how we learn from one to the other. The problem is that it doesn't say that by the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. So basically, I'm going to call the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor item B and the Sir Avodah Kochavim item C. We're trying to learn out from B to C. But the problem is it doesn't say it by B. It says it by A. So B, which is Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, was learned from A, which is Par Kohen Mashiach. And now we're trying to learn from B to C. But remember, there's a very famous principle in Kachim that you can't do that. There's no, I don't know what that's called in math, distributive property or something, right? You can't learn A to B to C. You're not allowed to do that when you come to Kachim. So says the Gemara inside, Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor Begufe Lo Ktiv. It doesn't actually say, if you open up the Chumash, about Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor that you burn the fat on the Mizbeach. We only know it Behekesha Ati, right? We only know it from a Hekesh. And the principle is, Davar Halamed Mehekesh can't be Choser Malamed Behekesh. So therefore, there's an extra word. Itzrich lipar, so we have the extra word asa lipar l'mahavi kiman dichtiv be begufe. Therefore, it's as if it says it by the section of Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, even though it doesn't, right? So we have an extra word to tell you as if it's written by the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor that you should burn the fats on the Mizbeach. And once it's written there, we can learn to the Sa'ir of Avodah Zarah. So therefore, lo lahavi, it doesn't get invalidated from having davar lamad behakesh, choser malamed behakesh. So that's why we need the pasuk. So it turns out that according to this, and this is really a continuation of yesterday, which is all is that we learn the par helam davar shel tzibor from the par kohen Mashiach, which is written right before it. We learn from the par helam davar shel tzibor to the sa'ir avodah zarah. But usually you can't learn out something from B to C. If B doesn't say it, you only learned it from A. But because there's an extra word in the pasuk is essentially saying to you, go against that rule, or this is in place of that rule. There's an extra word par, as if it says all the things by the par helam davar shel tzibor that it says by the par kohen Mashiach. So that is the sort of the end of the Breita. Says the Gemara now, in fact, there's a Breita. This was everything Rav Papa said yesterday.
Alex, so that rule prevents us from learning just if there wasn't an extra word?
Right. So essentially what the extra word is doing is that it's changing it from being a hekesh. Remember, a hekesh is essentially a comparison, right? Torah says these two things are similar. It doesn't always tell you how they're similar, right? Then you have to figure that out.
Similar without a gezerah.
Without a gezerah shava, correct. It's not the same as gezerah shava, which is one word, and it's not the same as a kal v'chomer, which
so the gezerah shava allows us to override that rule, basically.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's not a kal v'chomer, which we said yesterday. You can also override that rule because a kal v'chomer is a logical interpretation. A hekesh is more. It's much looser, right? It's a comparison, and it's up to you to make that comparison.
Logical.
So says the Breita now, and this is actually what Rav Papa was saying the last couple of days. Tanya kavatei Rav Papa. In fact, there's a Breita that really spells out what Rav Papa said. And this now, again, a lot of this is repetitive, but it's now in the Breita. Says the Breita, we're quoting snippets from the Psukim. It says, again, at the end of Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, Va'asa, now it doesn't actually say Asa Kasher Asa, it says Asa Lapar Kasher Asa, Lapar Chatat. But says the Breita, it could have just said, Va'asa Kasher Asa. Do for this like you did for the parachatat. Mata malomer lapar. Why does it say va'asa lapar? Do for the bull. Kasher asa laparachatat. Says the Breita lefishenemar because it says elsewhere, and again, this is what it says later by the Sa'ir Avodat Zarah in Parshat, what's the Parsha? Shlach. It says, V'heim heviu et karbanam ishel Hashem, al v'vi chatatam al shigagatam. Right? They should bring a karban to Hashem, a chatat for their mistake. And says the Breita, chatatam, what's a sin? A sin always means avodah zarah. Elo sirei avodah zarah. That's referring to sirei avodah zarah. And what is the word shigiga? Right? Chatatam al shigigatam means a sin offering on their mistake. A mistake means shigigatam zeh par helam davar shel tzibor. A mistake is when the tzibor makes a mistake and does something wrong. And the fact that the Torah used that language, chatatam al shigigatam, is to tell you, Amr Torah, chatatam harehi lecha kishigigatam, that when you do a chet, when you bring an animal for a sa'ir avodah zarah, treat it exactly like the animal that you bring for par helam davar shel tzibor, for shigaga, right? And now continues the Breita, and this is speaking out what we just said. Shigigatan mehecham lamadata. Now, how do you know by a shogeg, by a par helam davar shel tzibor, that you're supposed to burn the fat on the mizbeach? You don't know that because it doesn't say it by par helam davar shel tzibor. Lo behekesh. You learn that from comparing par helam davar to par kohen Mashiach, right? Ask the Breita. So then, how can you learn from par helam davar shel tzibor to sa'ir avodah zarah? V'chi davar lamad behekesh chozer malamed behekesh? Question mark. Can a thing that was derived from a hekesh, par helam davar shel tzibor, learned from par kohen Mashiach, then go ahead and teach about sa'ir avodah zarah? Therefore, says the Breita, which is again exactly what we just said, Talmud Lomar, therefore the Breita says, Lapar, right? Instead of saying vasa to this animal, kasher asa lapar chatat, it says vasa lapar, kasher asa lapar chatat, to tell you lapar zepar helam davar shel tzibor, that's number one, and lepar, due to this par, what you did to the other par, is that kohen Mashiach, zepar kohen Mashiach. So instead of it just being a simple hekish comparing this animal to the one before it, there's extra words to tell you that it's as if it's written beferish in the Torah by par helam davar shel tzibor, you're supposed to burn the fat. Once you treat it as if it's written there, you can then use a hekish and compare the par helam davar shel tzibor to the sayir avodah zarah to tell you that you burn the fat of that animal as well. So again, this is exactly what we just said. The Bright just speaks it out. Obviously, Rav Papa did not have this Brighta, or he would not have said what he said as if he made it up, right? So clearly it was his own logical thing before he knew the Brighta. Continues the Gemara now. After we prove that this is the case, let's analyze this Brighta a little bit more, right? Says the Gemara, Amar Mar, Chatatam, it says Chatatam, remember we said Chatatam al Shigagatam, that Chatat is a word that often refers to Avodah Zarah. Shogeg is a word that refers to mistakes. So Chatatam told you Avodah Zarah, and Shogeg told you Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. Says the Gemara, but why do you need a pasuk to tell you that the Sayir Avodah Zarah is done just like the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor? Typically, Mikra Kama. Why don't we learn it from the earlier pasuk in Vayikra? Damar Mar, because we had a Braita, and again, we quoted this yesterday, that it says, Asa lepar, do for the par, kasher asa lepar, hachatat. And we learned yesterday the word hachatat is extra, larabot sirei avodah zarah. So we already know that you compare par helam davar shel tzibor to sirei avodah zarah for all the halachot of that animal. So why do you have another verse later on in Shlach? Amar of Papa, Yitzchak. No, in fact, you need two psukim. Because if you only had one pasuk, I would have thought that when you say you compare a par helam davar shel tzibor to a sa'ir avodah zarah, hani mean the hazaot. You compare them for the things that are written in the Torah. By a par helam davar shel tzibor, it talks about shechting it, sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach and towards the parochet, and it doesn't say anything about the fat. So I would have thought, apply those rules, hazaot, v'chtivam begufei. They're written in the parsha, Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. Turn the page. Aval yoteret ushtei klayot, but the burning the fat on the mizbeach to lo chtivam begufei, which it doesn't say those, right? Again, we learn them from Par Kohen Mashiach, but it doesn't say them in the parsha, Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor. Therefore, emalo, you might think that when you compare the sa'ir to the par, you only compare it for the things written by the par, Kamash Malan, that basically a second pasuk, that even though it's not written, you still compare it. Now, we asked earlier today, so what if you have another limit for it, but you can't learn a hekish to a hekish? And that's where we said the word hapar is telling you that it's not actually it's not considered a hekish to a hekish, it's considered written to a hekish, meaning one level, but you do need a second pasuk in order to convince you that that's doable. So that is the way we understand, and hopefully everyone has a great knowledge now of how these karbanot work. The psukim are complicated, the Gemara is complicated, everything's complicated. But says the Gemara today, now we're at the two dots, of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Bet. Amar le Rafuna Breder of Natan Rav Papa. As Rafuna Breder of Natan Rav Papa, I have another question in this topic, right? Because you're saying, and this, if you recall, again, I'm taking us back to yesterday, I think, maybe it's actually 2 days ago by now, where Rav Papa said that when we compare the other karbanot, especially the sa'ir, to the par helam davar shel tzibor, we compare it for three things, right? Remember, we had three things that we compare it for, that even if you have a wound on your finger, you can sprinkle the blood, and there has to be enough blood to dip in, right? Not to sprinkle, but remember, you dip your finger in, taval etzba'o badam, right? So you stick your finger into the blood. So we learned from 2 days ago that we have an extra word of et, which tells you that even if there's something on your finger, it's not a problem. It's not going to be an issue. There has to be enough blood in the cup for you to get, when you put your finger in you can't combine two cups together. And you have to actually dip it in. You can't take blood from this wall, right? From the side of the kos. So that was something that Rav Papa quoted 2 days ago. Was it 2 days ago? I think it was 2 days ago. Yeah. So saying. Says the Rav Funa Breder not the Rav Papa, but there's another Braita. The Tana says, now we're quoting the Braita,
that yesterday, maybe he learned it 2 days ago.
That par, was it yesterday? Okay, I can't remember you're correct. It's the bottom of Daf Mem Amud Aleph, so yesterday, right? Where he said Ledam le'et dam utfila, right? So that was yesterday, correct. So said Rav Hurin Breder of Natan to Rav Papa, but the Braita says, now we're quoting the Braita, Par Yom HaKippurim l'chol ma shamar b'inyan kamar, that the Par Yom HaKippurim is taught, is compared for all the things that are written, not just those three, meaning everything. So how could you say it's limited to those three? Says the Gemara, said Rav Papa, you're right, there is Tnai. In fact, this is very confusing because there's two Tanaim, meaning, and Rashi goes through it a little bit over here, there's two Tanaic traditions, right? About, remember, the Tanaim would gather together different Braitot. But there's the Tana Debe Rav, Marbi Hachi. What the way I said it to you, said Rav Papa, is the Tana Debe Rav, which Rashi says is the Stam Tarat Kohanim, is Tana Debe Rav. But there's another sort of version, which is called the Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael. And the Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael, lo Marbi Hachi. Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael does not agree with what I said. And according to the Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael, you basically don't need, you don't learn from this pasuk that everything is included, and you need another pasuk to tell you about the Yoteret and the Klayot, Yoteret HaKavein, the Yoteret and the Shtei Klayot. So that's a machloket Tanaim. Says the Gemara, well, according to Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael, now Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael, who say basically that everything is included, but it's split up. So, the question, this is more of a philosophical question, right? We basically, throughout the whole sugya, have said the rules of burning the fats are said by Par Kohen Mashiach, which again is when the Kohen Hagadol makes a mistake and does a sin. The rules are then applied to the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, where the Tzibor forgets something and does a sin, and then we take the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor and learn it for other things. We learn the Sa'ir and we learn Yom Kippur. We learn other things from there. But why did the Torah write it that way, right? Why did the Torah say burn the fats when it's talking about the par of the Kohen Mashiach, but it didn't say burn the fats when it's talking about the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor? Says the Gemara, actually, I guess it's Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael, that's the Gemara's answer. In fact, think about it as a parable. Mashal lamelech basar v'dam. Think about a normal king, and obviously we compare God, we say kavi yachal, right? But that there's attributes that are like what you would think of a human king doing. A human king, about melech basar v'dam, who gets upset, sheza'am al ohavo, right? He gets angry at someone he loves. So someone he loves did something wrong, in this case did a sin, forgot the halacha. But there are times where a person where the king will be mi'ait, they'll minimize their anger because they love the person, right? Meaning that basically, when Rashi understands that because one is the par of an individual and the other is the par of the whole community, Hashem doesn't want to say so many things about the whole community. So therefore the Torah doesn't say, means we don't want to talk too much about it. So there's a whole list of what you're supposed to do. But the Torah tries to rush us through it because we don't want to talk too much. It's very anthropomorphized, I guess. You don't want to talk too much about the sin of all the people. So the Torah basically tries to make it shorter. Now, it could have made it even shorter, right? But anyways, it tries to make it shorter when it talks about the sin of all the people because these are the people that God loves. Ask the Gemara the next
Make it
part.
shorter.
I'm sorry?
Like no, it's like the person giving a daf yomi share.
Okay. Sure
No, they rush through it, so sometimes it's hard to capture it.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Got it. But that's that. I don't like that analogy, but I'll accept it. Continues the Gemara, but Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael. But furthermore, the second question about we asked Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael. Sorry, it's not asking them. They taught this. Sorry, Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael said the following: Mipnei ma nemra parochet hakodesh bepar kohen Mashiach. When it talks about, it's very interesting also, if you go through the psukim, you'll see there are slight differences in what we say, right? So both the Par Kohen Mashiach, and the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor are sprinkled on the parochet, right? However, by one it says sprinkle the dam on the parochet hakodesh, the holy parochet, and by the Par Helam Davar it just says parochet. It doesn't say kodesh, right? So why it says the Tana Debe Rabbi Yishmael does it say Mipnei ma nemra parochet hakodesh bepar kohen Mashiach? It says parochet hakodesh by the holy parochet by the Par Kohen Mashiach. Below nemar bepar helam davar shel tzibor, and it doesn't say it when it gets to the par helam davar shel tzibor. Says the Tana Rabbi Yishmael. It's also a comparison, a mashal parable. Mashal lamelech basar v'dam. It's also a parable to a human king. Shesarcha alav medina, right? Let's say, this is a fascinating statement. Let's say a country or a nation, means a country in that case, or a province, goes bad and they rebel and they do something wrong. Says the Tana Rabbi Yishmael, if a small number of people in this tzibur did something wrong, pamalya shlo mitkayemet. The king's pamalya, the pamalya is all, the entourage, the people all around the king, they are still in place because basically it's a very local failure. And that's why if the Kohen Gadol makes a mistake, it's still called Parochet HaKodesh. However, in Ruba Sarcha, if all the people or most of the people mess up, which is what a Paraham Davar Shel Tzibor is, then Ein Pamaya Shalom Mitkayemet. Then it's as if God's entourage is not even there anymore. And because of that, we can't say the word Kodesh. So it basically minimizes Hashem, shockingly, because the people of Hashem are sinned. And so just like with a regular king, if one country does things wrong, it reflects poorly on the king. Basically, this reflects poorly on God, so to speak. And so therefore, it doesn't say the word Parochet HaKodesh when it talks about the community, which is a fascinating and shocking thing to say. Anyways, sorry?
Stanislav says a comment on Pamalia. He says it's a Latin borrowed loan word from familia, which did not mean family, unlike English and all modern Romance language. It actually meant the entire attendance and all those tied to a family estate. So it's everyone around Hashem.
Yeah, correct. But just the statement, Rashi adds the word kaviyachol, which our Gemara does not add, which is that it's as if ein kan kedusha. That if the people rebel, essentially the kedusha is lost from the parochet, which is again a shocking thing to say, but Tana Rebbe Shmuel say it. Okay, so that gets us to the two dots. Now back to again, I encourage everyone to review if you want to the psukim of the things we just did because they're very confusing, but we have to move on because as Ken did say, Daf Yomi keeps moving. So the Mishnah, if you're going out with the two dots, and we're referencing back the Mishnah, which was like 5 or 6 days ago. So if you recall, the Mishnah had a principle that basically said, and we've said this many times already in the first 40 daf of Zevachim, that there is a concept called pigul, right? Pigul is where you shecht an animal or you do zrika on an animal with an intention to eat it in the wrong time, right? Or that's pigul, the wrong chutz lizmano, or to burn it in the wrong time. If you have an intention to do it chutz limkomo, then it's not pigul, but it's pasul. Okay, that means outside of the right space. Now, our Mishnah had a question that we've had a principle before, which we think everyone agrees to. We're about to see that that's not universal. That you basically have to do pigul in kol hamatir. The whole process of sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach, let's say, which is what's matir, an animal to eat or a karban to eat, you have to have pigul in the whole process. But if you're ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir, however, our Mishnah pointed out that even though the Torah says to sprinkle the blood 2 times or 4 times by different animals, according to Beit Hillel, you only need to do 1. Meaning, even though the Torah says to do it 2 or 4, if you do 1, you're mechaper. And so, therefore, if you do 1, you're mechaper. If you do think of pigul with the first sprinkle or the first placement, that's pigul, right? Because you really only need to do 1. If you then think during the next 1 or 2 or 3 placements that you're not thoughts that are not pigul, it doesn't matter. You already did it, right? Except, said our Mishnah, for the karbanot that were done inside. Because the karbanot that were done inside that had to have 4 placements on the mizbeach, every one of those is necessary. And therefore, said our Mishnah, I'm reading it from the Mishnah, I guess, but our Gemara is the same quote. Lefikach, therefore, it's the last line in the Mishnah, Natan kulan ketikunan. If you place all of the placements on the mizbeach the right way, ve'achat shelo ketikunan, you do 1 incorrectly, psula, that animal is pasul, but ein bo karet, you're not chayiv pigul. Okay, and we think what that means, at least this point, that you did 3 of them correctly, 1 of them incorrectly, chutz lizmano, but even though you did 1 of them incorrectly, because the other 3 were done correctly, it's not pigul. Because you can't do pigul in what's called chatzi matir, half of a matir. Now, says the Gemara today, there's another Mishnah, remember that there's complementary Mishnayot to most of the Mishnayot in Zevachim in Masechet Menachot, right? Zevachim talks about the animals, Menachot talks about the flour offerings, and they're very similar. So with the flour offering, what do you put on the mizbeach? Not blood, because there's no blood in flour, but you put the komets, right, which is when you put your hand in and you take out a portion, and you put levona, you put spices on the mizbeach. So both of those are necessary. So says the Mishnah now, I'm at the two dots, Danatam, we have a Mishnah there, meaning there in Menachot, that if you're pigel b'kometz, you have a machshava of pigol when you put the komets on the mizbeach, velo b'levona, but not when you put the spices. So you do the spices correctly, let's say, or b'levona velo b'kometz, you put the spices on with pigol, but not the komets. Rabbi Meir omer pigel v'chayven lav karet. Rabbi Meir surprisingly says that even though only one part of it was pigol, the whole animal, not animal, the whole korban is pigol, and you're chayv karet. And the Chachamim say, ein bo karet ad shifagel b'chol hamatir. There's no karet for this pigol. It's not pigol unless you do the whole matir with the thought of pigol, meaning both the kemitza and the livona. Okay, now that's a Mishnah actually. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish. I'm Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Don't make a mistake of interpreting it the way I just did it, me, right? Lo tema, don't say what I just told you. That time, Rabbi Meir de Kasavar mefagdim mechatzim matir. Don't think that Rabbi Meir argues with this principle and says that, even having a machshava about part of a matir is enough. That meaning, if you have to do two things for the animal and you have a machshava pigel with one, that's enough to make it pigel. And the corollary in our Mishnah would be, even though you have to put 4 places of dam on the mizbeach, if you have a machshava pigel about one of them, that's enough to make it pigel. That is not correct. That's not what Rabbi Meir holds, according to Reish Lakish. So what does Rabbi Meir hold? Elahacha b'mayaskim, in the case of Rabbi Meir, is not where you did part of it correctly and part of it incorrectly. It's kigon shenatan et kometz b'machshava. You put the komets on the mizbeach thinking of pigel, thinking I'm going to eat it, or I'm going to burn it. I guess eat it chutz lizmano, and tomorrow. But then you did the levona b'shtika. Then you put the levona on the mizbeach and you said nothing. So the question is, says Rabbi Meir, kasaver kol oseh dat rishona hu oseh. Says Rabbi Meir, that's not nothing. You did the first part wrong. Second part is wrong also. Right? Meaning it follows the first one. And therefore, Rabbi Meir holds its pigol not because you're mefaga b'chatzi matir, but because since you did the first one wrong and you didn't change what you're doing for the second one, it's as if you did the second one wrong also. And the Chachamim come and say, we disagree. If you didn't explicitly do the second one wrong, it's not pigol. That's Reish Lakish's explanation. Now, says Reish Lakish, how do I know that? How do I know this opinion?
These are thoughts, or you said something?
Rashi claims you have to say it. So, or you just said nothing. Right? But Rashi says, he talks about actually here, several times Rashi does it, but here's one of them where he says
pigol is not a wrong thought, it's a wrong, you vocalize your intention.
Correct. You vocalize your intention. So according to Rashi's, again, this is not universally agreed. The Rambam, I think, disagrees with this, but Rashi understands that you speak it out. So basically, you said, when we say machshavat pigol, we mean you spoke out that you're thinking this, right? So you spoke out about the first one that you're doing it for pigol. The second one, you didn't say anything. Says Rabbi Meir, well, that makes it pigol. Say the Chachamim, that's not enough. You have to explicitly say it by the second one. That's what Reish Lakish explains the machloket.
In the case where we have 4, if you do 3 wrong and 1 correctly, is that okay? Or do we go by the majority?
No, so according to what we're saying now is you have to do all 4, in the case of 4, have to be pigol. The question is, if let's say, we're about to get to our Mishnah for now, but let's say you did the first one with pigol and said nothing for the next 3, presumably according to Rabbi Meir, that would be pigol, because since you said nothing, you do it al dat rishona. We assume, you said I'm doing it for this, you want all of them for that. But if you explicitly said, I'm doing this one to eat today, meaning to do it correctly, then it would not be pigol according to anybody, according to Reish Lakish. Now,
even if you did 1 out of the 4 correctly, it'd be okay.
Correct. Well, it wouldn't be. Well, that's a different question. So that's a whole nother question. You raised a great point. Tosas here talks about at the bottom. Our Gemara makes it sound like it would still be puzzle, just not pigol. There's other Gemaras that make it sound like it wouldn't even be puzzle, but our Gemara does sound like it's not okay, but it's not pigol, right? Now, mimai. Now, says Reish Lakish, how do I know this? Okay.
And did you say the order had to be the komets and then the spices?
You can do either way, but you have to do one first. So in this circumstance,
Rashi says here you can go other way. מחשבה תחילה, קומץ מחשבה תחילה, ואחר כך הלבונה בשתיקה, והוא הדין אם נתן לבונה במחשבה תחילה, ואחר כך קומץ בשתיקה.
Correct. So you can go either way, but the point is that the first one has to be pigol. The second one is nothing. You said nothing. So what Rabbi Meir is saying,
But it doesn't say, Rashi says it's b'machshava. It doesn't say b'peh.
right? But Rashi says elsewhere here in the same Rashi that it's pepeh. So continues the Gemara, mimai. Now, how do I know that? Midiktani, because since the Mishnah, now we're going back, this is Rish Lakish's proof from our Mishnah. Listen to our Mishnah. Be very, listen carefully. Our Mishnah said, now I'm quoting the Mishnah, Lefika, therefore, since all four matanot of the Karban Bifnim are necessary, Im Natan Kulan Ketikunan, if you put all of them down, the first three down correctly, Va'achat Shelo Ketikuna, you do one incorrectly, and we think one incorrectly means that you did it with saying, I'm doing this chutz lizmano. Then says our Mishnah, Pasul ve'ein bo karet, right? That's again, this is a quote from our Mishnah. Now says Reish Lakish, think about the flip side of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah was very careful to say it this way, right? That you did the first three correctly, and we think here that correctly means you didn't say anything wrong. So you just didn't say anything. And the fourth one was done chutz lizmano. But let's say you switched it around. Let's say you did the first one chutz lizmano and the next three correctly. It sounds in our Mishnah like that would be pigul, right? That the only reason it's not pigul is because the first three were done correctly and the fourth one was the problem. But if you did the first one as a problem and the next three quietly, it would be pigul. Now, why would it be? Let's read that inside. Ha'achat shelo kitikuna. If you do the first one with a thought, or right, a thought chutz lizmano, the kulan kitikunan, and you do the rest of them properly, then it would be pigul, right? Because you just did one chutz lizmano and the other three you said nothing. Now, money. Who would be the Tana who feels that opinion? Ilema Rabbanan. If you say it's a Rabbanan, the Rabbanan disagree. Amri Rabbanan mefagdim mechatzi matir. Rabbanan say you can only do pigul if you explicitly say by every single matir, meaning all four applications of blood, that you're doing it chutz lizmano. Ella must be Rabbi Meir. It must be Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is now the author of our Mishnah, and our Mishnah is clearly saying that if you do the first three correctly and the fourth one incorrectly, it's not pigul. If you did the first one incorrectly and the next three correctly, it would be pigul. If Rabbi Meir was saying it's pigul because you don't need to do pigul for all four, then the order shouldn't matter, right? The fact that you did the first three correctly and the fourth one incorrectly should also be pigul, right? Now, it would be that even the way our Mishnah said it would be pigul. Elalav says Reish Lakish mishum de kasaver, must be that Rabbi Meir holds you can't do pigul with half a manter, but he holds kola osel dat rishanahu oseh, that the whole point is that if you're quiet, it all goes after the first one. And so that's where, and now it makes sense that our Mishnah is saying that if you think the first three correctly and then the fourth incorrectly, it's not pigul. But if you did the first one incorrectly and the next three correctly, now correctly meaning not incorrectly, meaning you said nothing, then it would be pigul. Because according to Rabbi Meir, if you explicitly say, by the first act, I'm doing it chutz lizmano, and you don't change by saying something different, everything else is done chutz lizmano. And so that is his proof, very nice proof from our Mishnah. Says Rosh Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, not really a great proof. Because, you know what I could tell you, says Rosh Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, Olam, our Mishnah is going Rabbanani. Right? Our Mishnah is going like the Rabbanan. Now you said, how could it be the Rabbanan, right? Because according to the Rabbanan, our Mishnah makes it sound like the first three were done correctly, and then the fourth was done incorrectly is not pigul. But if you'd done it the opposite way, it would be pigul. If you did the first one incorrectly and the next three correctly, it would be pigul. But why is it pigul? Says Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, it's because when we say the word correctly, we don't mean what you think. It doesn't mean you did the first one incorrectly and the next three correctly, meaning you did them without a bad machshava. What it means is you did them correctly for pigul, meaning you did them with the exact same thought. My kitikunan, lolam rabbanani, my kitikunan the pigul. That's impossible to say that's what it means, because the Mishnah contrasts. Hamiditani, the Mishnah says, Lefikach natan kulan kitikunan, v'achat shelo kitikunan, pasul ve'ein bo karet. Right? Meaning, the Mishnah says you do some correctly, meaning and some incorrectly. Right? So Rashi explains, if it had meant what you said, it could have said, you did all of them kitikunan, chutz mi'achat. Right? Or without one of them. But the fact that you said you did all of them kitikunan and some of them shelo kitikunan is clear. Michlal tikunan, when we say you did it correctly, it means not you did it correctly in a bad way. It means the hachshira odata, you did it correctly. So that is not what it means. So says Rava, I have a different explanation that will explain it according to Rabbanan. And what is Rava's explanation? That when the Mishnah says that you did 3 kitikunan, which means you did them properly, and you did 1 shelo kitikuna, right? That means my shelo kitikuna chutz limkomo. It means you did it not chutz lizmano, which is usually a thought that would make something pigel. You did it with the thought chutz limkomo, and that's why it's not pigel. And Rav Ashi and the right, that's why it's not pigel. Rav Ashi says that, the same answer basically, but just a different version, which is that when we say shelo tikuna, what we mean is shelo l'shmo, right? It's a carbon chatas, remember, because it was done inside, and so you did it a carbon chatas for the wrong person, which is as we said in the beginning, the Masechta apostles the carbon, right? And so basically, what the Mishnah is saying is that you did some of it correctly, some of it incorrectly, and that's why you're not chayiv pigel. Now, says the Gemara, but then the implication of that would be, right? You would be mechayev, right? Now, the Mishnah, you have to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if you did it this way, where you did 3 parts correctly, and the 4th part not correctly, you would be, it's pasul, but ein chayavin alav karet, right? Which, if you're telling me that what that means is that you thought chutz l'mkomo, or you thought chutz l'mkomo, or you thought shelo l'shmo, that's why it's pasul. What you would then seem to be saying is that if you had a machshava that was not chutz l'mkomo or shelo l'shmo, meaning it was chutz l'zmano, then you would be chayev. But that's not true, because according to the Rabbanan, the fact that you did most of it correctly, 3 parts correctly and 1 part incorrectly, takes it out of pigel. So the language of our Mishnah is misleading, right? Because the language of our Mishnah implies, according to what you're saying now, that you're not chayiv pigel because your thought was shelo l'shmo or chutz l'mkomo, sorry. But that's not true. No matter what your thought was, it wouldn't be pigel. Answers the Gemara, you're right. In fact, you're 100% right that even if you had done the last one not for chutz l'mkomo or shelo l'shmo, it would not be pigel. But the point is that the Mishnah wants to use this language because I did the Tana Reisha, Pigol v'chayavin alav karet, Tana Nami Seifa pasol ve'im bo karet. Remember, the beginning of the Mishnah, if you recall now going backwards, was talking about a case where it was a regular karban chatat, right? Where Beit Hillel said, even though the Torah says to put it in all 4 corners, if you only do 1, it's kosher. And if you only do 1, it's kosher. If you did the first one with the thought chutz lizmano, and you did the next 3 with any thoughts at all, chutz limkomo or shelo l'shmo or anything like that, it would still be pigel. Why would it still be pigel? Because you don't really need the other 3. You just did the first one, it's essential. You did that one for pigel, the whole thing is pigel. But so therefore, because we wanted to contrast it, the first part of the Mishnah says, it's pigel and chayavin alav karet, Tananami Seifa. So therefore, the second part of the Mishnah says, pasul ve'ein bo karet, that it's pasul, but you don't get karet. But the truth is that even if you hadn't had the thought that you had, you would still not be chayiv karet. So it's not there to tell you pasul ve'ein bo karet, meaning if you didn't do it this way, you would be chayiv karet. It's because we're saying pasul, the animal's not okay, right? But no matter what you had thought, it would not be okay. And so therefore, essentially, you can't basically prove from here that if you had done this with again, let's get the case back to our Mishnah, right? Let's say you take a chatas that's panim, right? It needs 4 places on the corners, right? So you do number 1, 2, and 3, right? We say kitikunan, and kitikunan now, according to this explanation of both the last 2 explanations, means you did it as if you would do pigel. So you did chutz lizmano. So you put it on the mizbeach and say, I'm doing this chutz lizmano. I'm doing this chutz lizmano. I'm doing this chutz lizmano. And then the 4th one was done shelo kitikunan, right? And we had 2 explanations. What does shelo kitikunan mean? One was you did it chutz limkomo, and one was you did it shelo l'shmo. Because all 4 are essential, and that 4th one is a different psul, it doesn't make it pigel. So we asked, what if you had done the 4th one without any thought whatsoever, right? It implies it would be pigel. It says, well, not necessarily. Because all the Gemara is trying to point out, all the Mishnah is trying to point out here is that in the Reisha, it was pigel. In the Seifa, it's not pigel. But the reason it's not pigel is because you did a different machshava that was a psul in the animal that was not a pigel machshava. In this case, chutz l'zmano or chutz l'mkomo or shelo l'shmo. But essentially, you can't prove from here what the case of Reish Lakish, which is if you forgot to say anything, you didn't say anything, right? What happens if you do 2 parts or 3 parts chutz lizmano and then you're quiet about the 4th part? We don't prove that from our Mishnah, so you can't prove it from here, and we leave it basically as an open question. But interestingly, Reish Lakish, of course, said very explicitly that I'm of the opinion that, in fact, if you're quiet with the last part, it is just what you did earlier. You do al dat rishona, and you would be chayiv pigel in such a case. Now, we're at the 2 dots. Does anyone want to do 2 more minutes or 3 more minutes? Or go to bed?
I can stay. I can stay.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do
Let's
it.
do a few more minutes. I don't want to go too much because you have to do the daf. But I'll read the Breita, and then tomorrow we can talk about the Breita. I'll leave it as a cliffhanger. So it says Mar Meitve, they have a problem from the following Breita. Now Rashi explains very helpfully that this Breita is a Tosefta on our Mishnah, right? Because the Tosefta starts in the middle of a sentence, so you don't know what it's talking about. It says B'med Dvarim Amurim. When is that true? When is what true? So Rashi says this is like an addition to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said basically that if you bring a carbon chatat according to Beit Hillel, you only need to put one sprinkling of blood on the mizbeach, and therefore, if you have a thought about that one, first one, it's pigel. Says the Breita now, b'med varmum. When is that true? That's only true about a regular carbon chatat that's brought on the mizbeach hachitzon. Aval, top of daf membet amid aleph. Aval, damim hanitznim al mizbeach hapnimi. But blood that was done on the inside mizbeach can go in arba'im v'shalosh Yom Kippurim. This is a great Gemara, right? The 43 times that blood was put inside on Yom Kippur, Rashi helpfully here goes through the 43, right? When was it 43 times? So Rashi, I'll do it, right? Why not? Rashi says that, if you recall, generally when you sprinkled the blood inside, you did achat lamala v'sheva lamata, right? Or achas v'yachat. Okay, and you did that for the par, you did it for the sa'ir, right? So that's 8. 8 times 2 is 16. Rashi helps us out there. And then you did that both on the mizbeach and you did it on the parochet, right? So 16 times 2 is 32. Then what they used to do is they would mix, the Torah says, you mix the blood together. Remember, you mix together the dama par and the dama sa'ir, and you put it on each corner. So that's 4 more, that's 36. And then the last 7 are that you put 7 sprinkles on the top of the mizbeach, right? Sheva hazaot, so it's 43. So 43 applications of blood on the inside the Kodesh and the Kodesh. It's really all inside the Kodesh, okay? Some on the Mizbeach, some in front of the Parochet. So those 43 of Yom Kippur, in the second line of Daf Membet, Achad Asar Shel Par Kohen Mashiach.
Which badim are these?
Sorry?
Rashi says Beina badim. Which badim is he referring to?
The badim of the Aron. That's what
okay.
Torah says. You sprinkle it between the part at the Parochet, between the badim, but not inside. And the 11 of the Par Kohen Mashiach. Remember, the Par Kohen Mashiach, you did 4 and 7, so the 11. Achad Asar Shel Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor, which it says also the 11 of the Par Elam Davar Shel Tzibor. In those cases, now this is the Breita we're going to have to unpack tomorrow. Pigel, your chayiv pigel, whether you do it bein barishona, whether you do it in the first set. Rashi says the first set is the ones you do all the way inside the Kodesh, right? Really Kodesh HaKodashim, meaning the ones you do all the way inside. Bein b'shniya, whether you do it in the second set, which Rashi explains are the ones on the Parochet, in front of the Aron, in front of the Aron, yeah, or bein b'shlishit, or the third set, which is the ones that are done on the Mizbeach HaZahav, on the Mizbeach inside. Says Rabbi Meir Omer, Pigul v'chayv alav karet. If you have a machshava chutz lizmano in any of those 3 sets, you're chayiv karet. The Chachamim omrim, now these words are very important, ein bo karet ad sheyifagel b'chol hamatir. That in fact, if you only thought of chutz lizmano for a portion of it, you would not be chayiv karet, because you're only chayiv karet until you have the entire matir. Now, says the Gemara, what you clearly see from here is katani miyat, that the Breita said, pigo bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishit. Whether you did the first part, the second part, or the third part, and there's a machloket. Now, if you recall, Reish Lakish said the only time Rabbi Meir argues is when your machshava of pigol was in the first part, right? And then you were quiet for the rest. So since you had pigol at the first part, and you said nothing about the rest, the whole thing is pigol. But now this Breita very clearly says you could do pigol in the first part, the second part, or the third part. So that clearly is a problem for Reish Lakish. And we're going to stop here, leave it at that cliff here, so that tomorrow we can address, God willing, tomorrow morning, how Reish Lakish will get out of this Breita, or which implies that Rabbi Meir argues even if you have thoughts of Pigul at the end, not just in the beginning. So we'll stop there. I know it's a cliffhanger, but it's 45 minutes, so I want to leave something for tomorrow. We're going to learn tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. So everyone get a good night's rest so you can be in good shape now.
Well, there's no pigul according to the Chachamim.
Correct. But the question is, what does Rabbi Meir argue about? So the simplest reading of Rabbi Meir, which Rish Lakish does not like, is that Rabbi Meir holds you can be mefagel b'chatzi matir, right? That as long as you have a pigul thought about one part of it, that's pigul. But Rish Lakish didn't want to say that. So Rish Lakish came up with this idea that, oh, it's because you had pigul thought in the first part and you were quiet about the rest. So Rabbi Meir holds that the thought about one applies to all of it, and the Chachamim disagree. But this Braita says you could do pigul in the first, second, or third part, and therefore it contradicts Rish Lakish. We will see how he gets out of it tomorrow.
And it's not pigul, but the korban's pasul.
Correct. In all these cases, the korban will be pasul. Correct.
Right. Yasher koach.
Okay, have a good night. Good to see you all.
Thank you.